Now, I want us to keep rolling along because I do want a little bit of time at the end for some questions. Our final speaker is Jane Hutchinson. I met Jane for the first time this morning and confessed to her that I am jealous of her success. So Jane comes to us from Tasmania, where she's the Chief Executive Officer of the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, who has recently had much success in securing resources for conservation programs in that state. And Jane has also worked in the past with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community on similar sorts of philanthropic projects. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, isn't it awful having to go last with so many amazing projects? I feel humbled to be part of this session because there's obviously a lot of activity going on around the world and some really absolutely terrific projects. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but what I have for you, fortunately, is some fabulous images that will hopefully keep you from falling asleep or leaving. So what is the Tasmanian Land Conservancy and why am I here talking on the topic of multiple benefit conservation? Well, the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, TLC as it's fondly known, is a not-for-profit, non-government organisation. We were started in 2001 with a handful of committed volunteers and about $50 in the bank. And since then we've grown to protecting over 2% of the private freehold land in Tasmania for nature conservation. Our vision is to be a global leader in nature conservation and sustainability, which is a very large vision. And thank you, Andrew, for the kind comments about being jealous. So I'll just start this. Thank goodness there's other people that can drive these things. So in the remote Central Highlands in Tasmania, an innovative global partnership between Conservation International and BHP Billiton helped us create and manage a private nature reserve of 11,000 hectares of land, which is about 27,000 acres. The reserve is called the Five Rivers Reserve. It was formerly owned by a logging company and purchased by the Tasmanian Land Conservancy with very generous loans from the Elsie Cameron Foundation. The Five Rivers Reserve, as you can see, has open grassland valleys. It has open and old growth woodland and grasslands. It contains cushion plants, endangered sphagnum moss beds, and it has 5 natural river systems, hence the name. It's habitat for endangered wildlife and iconic wildlife that exists in Tasmania, like the Tasmanian threatened eagles, the wedge-tailed eagle, and the Tasmanian devil. And you would have seen as you walked into this room this afternoon some posters for the Save the Devil program. Well, the Tasmanian devil exists in the wild on this reserve. It's also home to endemic important fish such as the Clarence galaxus. And I wish that we had more scientists on our reserves because we have one endemic important fish that we know about that's nationally endangered. Imagine being in Veruia and having 500. I was incredibly impressed by that science and that research. So much of this land is adjacent to the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area and also a large adjoining property of 6,500 hectares, which is about 16,000 acres, which is owned and managed by the Tasmanian Aboriginal people for its cultural values and its natural values. And that's a very important partnership between the Tasmanian Land Conservancy and the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. The reserve, the 2 reserves combined cover about 20,000 hectares of land. So that's not insignificant in a small place like Tasmania. And what it does is it extends and it buffers the World Heritage Area. Now, there are also some important innovations and community benefits that arise out of this project, so it's not just a fabulous reserve for its habitat. The partnership approach to the cross-tenure land management, which has now been forged with the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and the Parks and Wildlife Service in Tasmania, means that we can now triple our ability to be able to manage some of the key threats that exist in this area of the world, such as weeds, disease, unlawful activities, woodhooking, things like that, as well as fire. The Five Rivers Conservation Project also has other benefits, such as ecosystem services. We heard a bit about that in relation to the Galapagos, and I'm sure all of you have been sitting in on various topics over the course of the Congress about ecosystem services. Well, we have a few ecosystem services projects that are live at the Five Rivers Conservation Area. These include a carbon project, due to the large amount of forest area on this reserve, as well as water catchment protection from the 5 different river systems that are there. Also things like recreation, so for artists, fishers, walkers, mountain bike riders. Nature education is something that is becoming more and more a tool being used, and an ecosystem service being provided by this reserve. And seed banks as well, so multiple community benefits. It also importantly provides income for the businesses that support these services. So an example of some of the income is the Tasmanian Land Conservancy's carbon project has now started to generate an income stream for our organisation. And that's thanks to the extraordinary generosity of Conservation International and BHP Billiton in allowing us to retain the income that we've generated from the carbon, and that goes back to continue our conservation work. So that's incredibly significant. And I'm very pleased to say that the carbon credit sales from the land that the Five Rivers area occupies is incorporated into Virgin Australia's carbon offset program. So next time you fly, choose Virgin Australia because you will be able to know that the carbon offsets, when you tick a carbon offset, that it goes directly towards the protection and management of this reserve, the Five Rivers Reserve. So that's pretty exciting to see a tangible direct benefit from a carbon project. In addition to carbon, we also have businesses such as a fly fishing business called Riverfly, and that business is small. It's an ecotourism business. I've stopped the beautiful images, unfortunately for you. So Riverfly runs a nature-based tourism business, and we have other nature-based tourism businesses that are also starting to operate from that reserve, which is really fantastic. We also had recently an art project that we undertook on the reserve called the Skullbone Experiment, named after one of the properties called Skullbone Plains. And from that, artists spent some time on the reserve. They made work. They had an exhibition which travelled around Australia and sold that work. So not just inspiring artists and connecting community, but also selling it. And I know they've generated an economy out of it because I bought one of the pictures and I'm still paying for it. But a separate and really fundamental component of the Five Rivers Conservation Project was that it established an endowment fund. And the endowment fund is for the long-term effective conservation management of the reserve. The endowment fund is 1/3 of the project's budget, which is quite incredible. So in terms of long-term sustainable financing, having an endowment fund of 1/3 incorporated into the design of the project from the start is quite extraordinary. What that does is that the interest from that endowment fund goes to pay for the long-term management and monitoring that's been established on this project area. So I'll talk a little bit about the ecological monitoring program, knowing I'm probably running out of time. But basically we've designed so we do the management such as weeding and fencing and all of those kinds of things that you have to do, fire management, keeping illegal activities at bay. But we've also established a long-term ecological monitoring program which basically is a robust, simple, effective, repeatable monitoring mechanism that's designed to be used by citizen science. So we've tried to keep it really simple. We've got multiple sites across the reserve, and the idea is that volunteers and anyone can go out and capture that information. It has to be processed by experts to some extent, but at least the capture of that information is easy and simple. So an example of that is that we have about 46 remote sensing camera sites that are on the reserve, and of those 46 sites, that has been a partnership between the Save the Devil program, Tasmanian University, University of Tasmania and the Tasmanian government. What we've been able to find is, for example, that from the 46 cameras that are remote and fire as animals walk past the site, of the 46, 35 of those cameras have detected Tasmanian devils, which is an endangered national species in Tasmania, and 6 of them have exhibited the deadly facial tumour disease. So we can have a little bit of information, basic information about the communities and species that exist on the reserve, and some information about the health of those animals. But the idea is that it's long-term and it's sustainable, which is absolutely terrific. And I'm ashamed to say that long-term sustainable financing mechanisms and long-term monitoring mechanisms for conservation has been sorely lacking in the project design of our reserves in the past, and I'm sure many other organisations and parks entities have experienced that as well. We've really failed in Tasmania as a scientific community to prioritise that properly, but the Five Rivers Conservation Project has just lifted that bar because now it's incorporated in the design and it's properly financed. So the really, thanks Andrew, but the really innovative thing about the Five Rivers Conservation Project is not that it's a landscape scale project that protects habitats and species and communities, and particularly some of the most endangered communities and species in Tasmania. It's not that there's partnership approaches across tenure boundaries. It's not that there's long-term ecological monitoring programs or management, and it's not that there's a effective and really significant endowment fund for the future. The really innovative part about this project is that it's all of those things together. So, thank you.